to log on, create time, make time for our weekly God Talk. I'm excited for tonight, and what I feel like tonight is going to be part two of the world within the text, which is a part of our series on biblical interpretation. So, for those of us who were here last week, we started the world within the text with a few different types of criticisms. Again, in order to read a text and understand what it is, you have to be a critic. You have to be able to examine, you have to be able to research what you've read. And that involves a type of criticism. So critic is not a bad thing within theological circles. It's a matter of what type of criticism are you applying. And so last week we talked about there's a rhetorical criticism, meaning that when the writers were writing the Bible, they were using rhetoric to write it. That's not a bad thing. There's no such thing as a writer not using rhetoric, because a writer who is using a certain type of rhetoric is trying to appeal to a certain type of audience. So last week we talked about how if we were to start a marketing company, we would appeal to an audience if we're doing a beer commercial much differently than we would if we were doing an AARP commercial, right? Like there may be some crossover, but for the most part, we're like, ooh, those are two different audiences. So that's kind of an example for, there we go. That's kind of an example for rhetorical criticism. They're using rhetoric. They're trying to use language, trying to use illustrations that the audience will understand. And so as any good marketer would do, so the authors would do the same thing. Then we also talked about form criticism. So look at what rhetoric is being used, and then look at the form. So when you look at the miracles, Jesus uses, the authors use a certain type of form in order to tell about Jesus's miracles. So anytime there's a miracle, it usually goes something to the effect of there's an introduction, there's a conflict, there's healing action, there's confirmation, and then there's a reaction, which is usually Jesus saying, but don't tell anybody I did that, right? There's a certain formula to it. If you were to tell a bedtime story, there is a form that you use to tell it. Once upon a time, and then at some point at the end, you're probably gonna say happily ever after. That's what the Genesis author did with Genesis 1, the creation story. And so it's important to know that they can be giving truth. And if for some of it, they could be given history, but you tell it a certain way. And so if you understand that, you don't get tripped up if somebody were to tell you the Babylonians have a creation story as well. You're like, okay, well, they may have even started with the same form. Some of us may not even have a problem reading it, but we just understand the Israelite creation story, or the one in the Bible, to be the one that we go by and the one that we find both truth and meaning in. So it doesn't, when you approach the Bible this way, you don't get tripped up if you find other stuff, because it's like, okay, well, they probably had the same form. There's probably a certain way to tell it. That's form criticism. And then we also talked about narrative criticism, with this caveat: there's no such thing. So narrative criticism is looking at the setting, looking at the plot, looking at the point of view. But also with this caveat, there's no such thing as a setting without a reader to be able to notice it. So there's a certain amount of human responsibility, potentially human error, whatever the case may be. Humans have to be involved in the interpretive process, even as it relates to narrative criticism. And the other thing that we don't talk about as much is narrative criticism is helpful when it comes to filling in gaps in the biblical narrative. So when Paul says women should be silent shortly after he says they need to have their head covered when they prophesy, it's all types of narrative people have made. Well, Paul told them to be silent in that context because, and then here they go filling in the gaps. It's not in the text, but sometimes we fill in gaps with things that we feel like he could have been talking about, or we may have seen somebody write. Same thing. And so last week, what we did was we read the introduction to Romans, and put that side by side with the introduction to Galatians. So last week, it seemed really lofty. It seemed real up in the air. But when you read those two side by side, you recognize that the way that the writer writes tells you a lot about what's going on and a lot about the author's feelings and potentially the audience to which he's writing. So Paul begins the book of Romans, as he normally does with the majority of his letters, with a note of thanksgiving. I'm so encouraged by your faith. I can't wait to come see you. You're an encouragement to me, like I'm an encouragement to you. Well, then Paul begins with the church in Galatians, and in the Rap Junior translation, he basically just begins with, y'all have lost y'all's mind. This is the beginning of the letter. You got to go back and read it if you haven't. Y'all are trying to teach two different gospels. Y'all have departed from the faith. And I don't even want to say two different gospels because there's only one gospel. Y'all are just tripping. And then he says something to the effect of, which can be a whole sermon within itself. You all are looking for the approval of men rather than the approval of God, right around verse number 12, if I remember correctly. So what does it mean when Paul is writing to the church in Galatia and begins not with thanksgiving, but begins with, really going in on them, right? If you go back and read it, it's like, whoa, that's how he started that letter versus the church in Rome. What are the differences? Could it be that? And when you notice those and put them side by side, then you can begin to ask proper questions. Could it have been that the church in Galatia had a certain educational level, and so there were certain things they rejected? Maybe they were a higher income congregation as a result of their educational level. These are all just guesses. They don't have to be true. They don't have to be right or wrong, but you can begin to ask certain questions and research certain things when you put these next to each other and realize that the word within the text, this Galatians letter is a lot different from this letter in Rome, aside from just their name. But look at how Paul begins it. Galatians was one of the few books that Paul wrote, letters that Paul wrote that didn't have a Thanksgiving letter at the beginning, section at the beginning of it. What does that mean? He's upset, clearly. And so that's what we talked about with the world within the text itself. So this week, we're going to talk about two different types of criticisms, and then we're going to get into some discussion and some dialogue. And so today for the dialogue and discussion, you're going to use all that you have captured so far. So we're going to talk about the world within the text, and we'll also have some time to even look at the world behind the text. So I want to try to get through this quickly to give you as much time as possible to do so. The first type of another type of criticism that is a part of the world within the text is intertextual criticism. I-N-T-E-R, textual, T-E-X-T-U-A-L. That's all one word. Intertextual criticism. And this is asking the question, how does one cite, allude to, or evoke another, and what meanings are created when the texts are set in relationship? How does one cite? How does one allude to? Or how does one evoke another? And what meanings are created when these texts are set into relationship? And so one example that the author uses that I think is brilliant is it says, sometimes intertextual reference is explicit. Sometimes it's implicit. Sometimes it's obvious. Sometimes it's not. Right. Hey, stay with me. You'll get it here in a second. But the author uses Acts 17:28. We believe Luke to be the author of Acts, but these are actually Paul's words that Luke recorded, where it says, we're probably familiar with it, for in him we live and move and have our being, as even some of our poets have said, for we too are his offspring. Luke depicts Paul as citing two Greek poets. I'm going to butcher their name, but it's Epimenides and Aratus. And why he uses them, we don't know whether he's trying to use a language that the audience would understand, or we don't know whether he's just flexing his Greek rhetoric, right? We don't know which one, but we do know that within that verse, he's talking about God. But while he's talking about God, he's using Greek literature or a type of cultural language that the everyday person supposedly is supposed to be able to understand. That's good news for somebody, because it lets you know that you can find God and you can talk about God in ways outside of thous and those and shalls. If God speaks to you in India Irie, then go on and use India Irie, and you can use Paul and you can use Luke as your example to say, hey, they did this in the Bible, and this was how they brought across truth. So another example of intertextual readings is certain times when New Testament writers will write their narrative or write their book as a fulfillment of either prophecy or previously established text. So in Jesus's triumphal entry into Jerusalem in Matthew 21, Matthew is using a citation to Zechariah 9:9. And even you can write these down and look at them for homework. It's really interesting to look at Matthew 21:5. And Zechariah 9:9. And so Matthew is using language and is using this text to say Jesus fulfilled the prophecy in Zechariah. But one thing that's interesting, if you go back and look at it, Matthew uses a lot of what Zechariah says, but then he leaves out the word triumph. Your question is, why in the world did Matthew leave out triumph? He brought in about the donkey. He brought in about the crowds. He left out triumph. Why did he leave that out? What does that mean? Right. These are things when you put things side by side in the world within the text, when you put these side by side, it's like, why did he omit this word? What could that have meant? And so that's one thing. Another type of criticism, and this will be the last one that we talk about because it'll lead us into our activity, is canonical criticism. Canonical criticism, Canonical. So you'll know that the canon is actually what we consider to be our Bible or our set of books that create the scriptures that we use. So canonical criticism asks how individual writings interact with other texts within canonized scripture or within the Bible. So when you're doing looking at the word within the text, you can apply canonical criticism. This is what we're going to practice. You can apply canonical criticism to ask, how does this scripture interact with this scripture that's within the same Bible? And just to give you some background, this is one of the few times I've ever almost gotten into an argument at church. I'll never forget, I was in a college class and the teacher wanted to tell me I was wrong because I told her that there were books that were written in antiquity around the same amount of times, even by people that we believe were written by people who were in the Bible, whose book did not make the Bible, did not make canon. Canon is the books that we have, did not make the canon. And she was upset. She was fed up. And I was just like, I mean, it is what it is. We can agree to disagree, but there are some things that sometimes church doesn't tell us because they don't want to be willing to ask questions or answer questions they may not know. Right. There's a lot of things about the canon that we don't know. What we do know is that there was a group of people who were scholars who were very trusted at the time that came together and said, we believe we're guided by the Spirit to say, hey, these books are inspired. These books these are the books for the Bible, and then read some of them and for various reasons said, I don't know about that one. So there is a Gospel of Thomas. There's a Gospel of Mary, right? Like there's all these other Gospels. There's more Gospels than just Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are the ones that we consider to be inspired, that the canonizers consider to be inspired. And these are the books that we read within the Bible. It doesn't mean that there weren't other Gospels written. Don't get the wrong impression. Just because these are the only four in our Bible doesn't mean they were the only Gospels written. They're not. These are the ones that the canonizer said. These are without a doubt inspired. And we believe that God had a hand in the writing of these. So take that, keep that, because it's important when we talk about canonical criticism. How does this scripture relate to other ones within the text? And so sometimes what canonical critics will do is they will try to create a canon within the canon. And our faith tradition is notorious for it. And so a canonical critic will attempt to, because remember, the Bible is a library. It's all these different voices, all these different genres, all these different types of people, all these different perspectives. One time it may say this and another time it may say this. Right. And so what the canonical critic will do is, in order to try to bring some cohesion with all these different voices within this Bible, within this library that we call the Bible, they'll try to find a central teaching and call it the canon within the canon. So this is what we have today when a lot of people will be reading the Bible and they'll talk about the Bible, but there's just certain parts of the Bible they don't talk about, right? When was the last time somebody heard a preacher get up and preach from one of the slavery scriptures? I don't know. I ain't never taught from it. And I know a lot of other people, well, I've never preached from it. I don't want to say taught. But there's a lot of other people that just like, this is a canon, but within the canon, I have my own canon that I keep up with, or that I believe to be most inspired, whatever the case is. So hang on to that, because what people with the canon within the canon do is they'll try to find one voice and look at the Bible through that one voice. So for some people, it's okay, this entire book is about being justified through faith. And that's their voice. Everything is looked at through that lens. Some people, it's okay, this is about the great commandment. For some people, this one voice is, all of this is looked at through the lens of love God and love your neighbor. Many of us probably know people who their canon within the canon, their central voice in scripture is there's only one church, right? That's a canon within the canon. That's a centralized voice. Other people, Jesus is coming back. That's what the whole Bible's about. God is coming back one day. For some people, Paul is the primary, Paul's writings are the primary readings that they go to solve things. Other people, the Gospels are the primary. And so when you talk about the canon, we're looking at where do you resort? How did these line up? How do these look next to other books? Looking at even the ordering of the books. So maybe Acts is before Romans because the canonizers wanted us to read Romans in light of Acts, in which we know Acts is where Saul changes to Paul. And so maybe you need this conversion in Acts before you appreciate any of Romans. Maybe that's why they put it in that order, right? So canonical criticism is looking at the canon, looking at the Bible and wondering how it got its order. How does this one text compare to these other texts? For us, it's very important that we understand canonical criticism was probably needed more, or maybe it wouldn't have mattered, but was probably needed more when it came time to slavery and slave masters. It's easy to go to one scripture and say, slaves, obey your masters. It's different to ask, okay, what does slaves obey your master have to do with Exodus? What does slaves obey your master have to do with all this freedom that Jesus is talking about? What does put them in conversation with each other, put them side by side, because if you don't examine this scripture in light of the larger context of the Bible, then it's very easy to take the scripture and make it mean what you want it to mean rather than what it might mean in the larger scheme of things. So it's important. We're as a society, we're a little bit past slavery, right? We're a little bit past, like, if we were to hear about somebody owning slaves right now, we wouldn't look at it and be like, slaves obey your master. We would look at that and be like, oh my gosh, how are they doing that? That's atrocious. That's unethical. That's ungodly. That's unjust, right? Like, that's the way we look at that now, even if scripture has some verses that say slaves obey your master. No matter how you dice it, slice it, it still says it. Whether they're paid slaves or unpaid slaves, it still says it. And we have to wrestle with, what do we do with this in the Bible? And so that's what we're going to be doing today. Is we're really going to be doing a type of wrestling at sorts, not with the topic of slavery, but looking at a scripture, two scriptures that both have to do with women and women's roles, and putting them in conversation with each other and trying to figure out what in the world do we do with these two texts within the same canon. So we could do slavery, but I think slavery would be a little easier. Today, we're going to be looking at these two texts that have to do with women's roles, which is 1 Timothy 2, 8 through 15. And I'll give this to you again in a second for those who are doing the breakout rooms with us. And then the other one is Galatians 3, 23 through 29. I don't want to give you too much. I want you to read them. I want you to look at the world within the text itself. I want you to do research to look at the world behind the text. And then we're going to bring it together and figure out, what in the world do we do with the text that says women submit, or women should not usurp authority. And then we would do with another text that says, like, there's no more male nor female in the kingdom. Right. These are the questions that we have to wrestle with. Doesn't mean we're going to come to one solid, conclusive answer tonight, because I haven't given you enough time in advance to do adequate research. And even then, your answer today may be different from your answer 5 years from now. But what is important is we begin to utilize these tools that are the world within the text. So comparing it to other texts within the Bible. What about this scripture? How does that change it? What about this scripture? And then also looking at the word behind the text. Why is he telling this to this audience and this to this audience? How do we reconcile that? Could it be that he's saying two different things to different audiences? These are all the questions that we're going to try to answer today.